What happens when the law tries to divide what love has already claimed? When a silent child finds her voice not for herself, but to protect the only person who ever stayed. Before we dive in, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and hit the subscribe button. Margaret stepped off the stagecoach with her hands trembling beneath kid gloves that had grown too tight in the heat. Dust clung to her hem and to her hope, though she tried not to show it. Calico Bend wasn't much more than a few crooked buildings huddled around a water trough and a lopsided chapel with a steeple that leaned east like it was listening to some far-off promise. She stepped aside as the driver hefted down her trunk, a battered thing with peeling green paint and a broken lock she'd fixed with string. She clutched her parasol even though the sun was dropping, casting long bruises of shadow across the street. She scanned the boardwalks, her eyes searching for a tall man in a preacher's coat, maybe holding a flower or tipping his hat with an air of bashfulness. But no one waited. No one moved. The saloon doors creaked in the wind, and two boys ran past barefoot with a tin pail. But there was no sign of the man who'd written her letters with perfect penmanship and promises of redemption. She stayed until the last passenger was gone, and the driver tipped his hat and rode off in a cloud of tired horses and dry indifference. Margaret remained still, her fingers now white on the handle of her trunk. A shopkeeper from across the street peered out and gave her a nod, as if to say this happened more often than folks like to admit. She squared her shoulders and walked toward the only place that didn't sneer at Hertha Bakery. The scent of yeast and sugar wrapped around her like something kinder than words. The baker's wife, round and red-cheeked, gave her a warm bed upstairs and asked no questions. Margaret didn't explain. She just handed over what coins she had and unpacked her comb, her Bible, and a photo of her sister long dead from fever. She stared at the ceiling that night and tried not to cry, because women who cried got pitied, and women who were pitied were women the world stepped around like broken things in the street. Days passed. She offered to help knead bread in the mornings and sweep in the afternoons. People started nodding when they passed her, though they always looked twice, as if waiting for her to slip up or disappear. But Margaret endured. She sat in the chapel alone on Sundays, watching dust motes dance in the light like prayers too shy to rise. She smiled when she had to and stayed silent when she didn't. And then, one evening, while taking stale bread to the alley for the pigs behind the saloon, she saw her. A girl no older than 8, with tangled black hair and eyes that did not blink. She was crouched beside a barrel, hands pressed against her stomach, ribs showing like a ladder leading nowhere. Margaret froze. The girl didn't run, just stared. Margaret placed the bread on a crate and walked away. The next night the bread was gone, so she brought more. And the night after that, she sat on the crate and pretended to hum while she waited. The girl didn't come. Not at first. But on the 4th night, she stepped out of the shadows and sat at Margaret's feet, silent and small. She didn't speak. Margaret didn't ask. They just shared bread in silence, and when it was gone, the girl pressed her fingers to Margaret's sleeve, just once, then vanished. Margaret stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of that tiny touch like it had sewn something new into the frayed fabric of her soul. That night, she whispered a prayer she hadn't dared in years. Not for a man to come, not for a past to be erased, but for the girl behind the saloon, wordless, nameless, real. Margaret didn't know the girl's name, and she didn't ask. Names felt like things you earned, like trust or time or belonging, and the child hadn't been given any of those yet. Every evening, she brought something from the bakery, biscuits wrapped in a napkin, a heel of rye, sometimes a broken cinnamon roll when the morning batch didn't sell. She placed the food on the crate and sat down beside it, never reaching for the girl, never pushing. And eventually, the girl started coming sooner, standing a little closer, eating without turning her back so sharply, though her eyes still held that wild tension, like a stray dog waiting to be kicked. Margaret understood. You didn't have to be born in an alley to know what abandonment tasted like. Her own childhood had been cold even in July, the house filled with voices that barked but never blessed. She had left at 16 and never looked back, but even now, the echo of slammed doors still followed her like a shadow that couldn't be outrun. So when the girl reached out one night and placed the crust of bread back into Margaret's lap with a shake of her head, Margaret understood that to it wasn't rejection. It was fear of taking too much. She broke the piece in two and ate half herself, then nodded. The girl finished the rest and wiped her hands on her dress, her eyes softer than they'd ever been. Margaret began to notice the bruises then. Faint outlines on the child's arms, fading ones on her temple. When she showed up with a limp one night and sat down slower than usual, Margaret's heart clenched in her chest. She wanted to ask, to demand, to find whoever had done it and leave claw marks down their pride. But the girl wasn't ready, so Margaret waited. Each night after her work, she snuck to the alley with a lantern and a bundle of food, and sometimes just sat there humming hymns beneath her breath. The girl began to sit beside her, then lean her head against her arm. Then fall asleep with her legs curled under her like a kitten that had finally found a warm hearth. It wasn't fast, it wasn't loud, but love never was. It crept in through the broken places and stitched itself into the quiet. One night, thunder cracked across the sky and the girl flinched hard against her, arms wrapping around Margaret's waist like she was something solid in a world that kept splitting. Margaret wrapped her shawl around both their shoulders and whispered words she hadn't used in years, lullabies her sister used to sing when they were both young enough to believe promises could be kept. When the rain started, they stayed like that, the child curled in her lap, both of them shivering and still and bound together by something deeper than names. The next morning, Margaret walked into the bakery early, placed a small loaf beside her boss's tea, and cleared her throat. "I'm going to need a second bed. Small one," she said. The baker's wife looked up, saw the tremble in Margaret's hand, the storm that still lived in her eyes, and nodded once. That afternoon, Margaret returned to the alley and held out her hand. No words, just skin to skin. The girl stared at it for a long time, then took it. Margaret led her to the little room above the bakery, to a cot beside her own bed with a quilt that had taken her 2 months to finish. She helped the girl out of her threadbare dress and into a clean flannel nightgown she'd bought from the general store. The girl led her, quiet as always, but when Margaret tried to brush her hair, she flinched hard. Margaret set the brush down and said, "Tomorrow, or the next day," and she meant it. The child didn't speak that night, but she slept with her hand fisted in Margaret's apron, like if she let go the world might take her again. Margaret didn't sleep much. She watched the girl's chest rise and fall and tried to remember the last time she'd felt like she belonged to anything. Maybe never. But as the wind howled outside and the bakery's ovens glowed below them, Margaret finally whispered something into the dark she hadn't said out loud in years. "You're safe here." The girl didn't answer. But in the hush before dawn, she rolled over in her sleep and murmured something into Margaret's side, so soft it barely counted as a word. But it was. It was the beginning. The child didn't speak for weeks, not even a whisper, not even in sleep. She moved like smoke through the bakery's upstairs room, silent as a breath held too long, always watching, always listening, but never forming words. Margaret never pushed. Instead, she filled the silence with small routines, the kind that gave a shape to days folding laundry just so, setting 2 places at the table, asking questions she never expected answers to. "You want butter or jam today?" she'd say while spreading toast. Or, "That bonnet's too tight, isn't it?" as she gently adjusted the one she'd bought for the girl at the church sale. The girl would blink slowly, tilt her head, maybe nod once, but never speak. It was like the world had stolen the words from her mouth and locked them up in a place too deep to reach. Still, she began to hum. Not songs, not melodies even, just little threads of sound that curled in the air while she traced patterns on the window pane or sorted the buttons Margaret had let her collect. It was something, and Margaret held on to it like a lifeline. People in town started to notice. "That girl livin' with you?" the butcher asked one morning, his voice low as he handed Margaret a bundle of pork wrapped in paper. "She yours?" Margaret didn't flinch. "She's mine as much as she needs to be." The butcher nodded, but others weren't so kind. "Stray's got thievin' eyes," a woman muttered outside the mercantile. "Looks like half-blood to me," another whispered in the chapel, loud enough that Margaret heard it 3 pews away. She didn't react. not in public. But that night, she sat a little closer to the girl as they shelled peas, her fingers brushing against the child's hand now and then, like a vow that didn't need saying. She didn't know what blood the girl carried, didn't care. All she saw were scars and silences, and a soul too young to be this broken. One afternoon, the sheriff came by. His boots echoed against the bakery's wood floor, too loud, too slow, like he wanted folks to hear him. "Got a report of some things missing from Jensen's stall," he said, thumb hooked in his belt, eyes not quite looking at Margaret. "Couple of coins, a handkerchief, some hard candy, nothing big, but still. His wife says she saw a little girl running off. Dark hair, skinny." Margaret didn't blink. "There's dozens of dark-haired children in this town." The sheriff shifted. "Jensen says he's willing to let it go if the child returns. What's his? Quiet like, no fuss." Margaret's voice was ice wrapped in velvet. "We don't take what isn't ours. You can let Mr. Jensen know that." The sheriff gave a nod, touched his hat, and left. That night, when Margaret returned from sweeping the stoop, she found the girl sitting on the floor beside her bed, eyes wide, breath shallow. In her lap lay a single peppermint candy, slightly dusty, wrapped in crinkled paper. Margaret sat down beside her, slow, deliberate. She didn't scold, didn't raise her voice. Just picked up the candy and placed it on the nightstand. "You don't need to steal, sweetheart. Not ever again." The girl didn't look at her, but her chin trembled. Margaret reached out and placed her hand gently on the child's head. "You're not bad, you're just scared, and scared things do what they need to survive." The girl finally looked up then, and something cracked open in her eyes, something sharp and trembling and human. Margaret held her close that night, wrapped her in a blanket of words and warmth, even though the girl didn't speak back. She didn't need to. The way she clung said more than syllables ever could. The next day, they returned the candy, quietly. Margaret placed it in Jensen's hand, without explanation. He grunted and walked away. But the rumors started anyway, that Margaret had taken in a thief. That the girl was wild, half Indian, probably not even Margaret's at all. She endured it, let the stares slide off her like rain on a tin roof. But that Sunday, when she walked into church with the girl holding her hand tight, the preacher paused mid-hymn. The room hushed. Margaret lifted her chin and guided the girl to their usual pew. They sat. They stayed. And when the service ended, Margaret didn't wait for the whispers. She stood up in front of the whole congregation and said, "This child is under my care. If anyone's got questions about her, you come ask me directly. And if you've got anything unkind to say, do it, knowing the Lord is listening too." No one spoke. The preacher gave a stiff nod. The girl said nothing. But later that night, as Margaret tucked her in, the child turned her face into Margaret's shoulder and let out one long, shuddering breath. It wasn't a word. Not yet. But it was close. It was almost a name. The day the girl disappeared, Margaret dropped a plate. It shattered on the bakery floor, sending shards skittering under the table and between her boots. But she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe, as the silence in the room stretched too long and too wide. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, it was absence. Absence of breath, of warmth, of the soft rustle of the girl's footsteps in the hall, the gentle clink of her sewing tin, the tiny humming noises she made when sorting buttons or brushing her hair in the corner. Margaret had risen before dawn, as always, expecting to find her curled on the edge of the bed, knees tucked under her chin like always, the first hint of light resting soft against her cheek. But the bed was empty, sheets cold. The dress she'd laid out the night before still hanging on the peg, untouched. Her shoes were gone, the shawl too. Margaret moved through the house like a ghost, calling her nameless girl in a voice barely above a whisper, searching every corner, every cupboard, as if she might be tucked behind the flour sacks or curled beneath the ironing bench. But the girl was gone, and something broke in Margaret she hadn't realized she still had left to break. She took to the street barefoot, hair still in pins, calling through the early morning fog that clung to the alleys like breath on glass. "Have you seen a little girl? Brown hair, quiet, wearing a red shawl?" But faces turned away, doors shut fast, and her chest burned with something close to panic, hot and wild and unfamiliar. She found herself standing in front of the sheriff's office without remembering walking there. Fists clenched, eyes stinging. Sheriff Whalen leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "She gone and run off?" Margaret's voice was raw. "She wouldn't. Not like that." He shrugged. "Might be she got scared. Or maybe someone came looking. Girl like that, no one's gonna miss her but you." Margaret didn't flinch. She turned and kept walking. Behind the saloon, she found a single scrap of red shawl caught on a broken fence post. Torn, frayed, like something ripped in struggle. Her knees gave out, and she knelt in the dirt, pressing the fabric to her face, breathing it in like it still held the child's warmth. She stayed there a long time, until the sun burned high and the streets buzzed with voices and judgment and footsteps that weren't hers. When she stood, her dress was dust-streaked, her hands scraped raw, but her eyes were cold steel. She knocked on every door from Main Street to the edge of the creek. She asked the stable hands, the blacksmith's boy, even old Mrs. Cartwright, who hated children like she hated noise. No one had seen the girl. No one had noticed. No one cared. That night, Margaret lit every lantern in the house and left the door open wide. She sat by the window with a pot of stew growing cold on the stove and waited and waited. At midnight, something moved. A soft scuffle, then a shape in the dark. Margaret flew to the door, heart in her throat hand. There she was. The girl, dirty, barefoot. Eyes wild and wide, cheeks scraped and a thin cut on her lip. Behind her, the shadows shifted, and two boys sought her, rough, with hard faces and empty eyes stood like wolves at the edge of the light. Margaret's voice broke as she whispered, "Come here." The girl didn't move, but her eyes locked onto Margaret's and then, slow as prayer, she took one step forward. One of the boys grabbed her arm. "She ain't yours," he said. "She don't belong to nobody." Margaret didn't hesitate. She stepped between them, fierce and blazing, and said, "She belongs to me. And if you touch her again, I swear to God himself I'll make sure you answer for it." The boy's hand twitched, but he let go. Spit at the ground. Not worth it anyway. And they disappeared into the dark. The girl stood shaking, lips pressed tight, hands clenched into fists. Margaret knelt in front of her, touched her cheek with a gentleness that made the girl close her eyes. "You're safe now. You're safe." And the girl, finally, blessedly collapsed into Margaret's arms, sobbing without sound, every shiver of her small body tearing something loose in Margaret's chest. She carried her inside, washed her wounds, wrapped her in warm blankets, and sat beside her until dawn. And though the girl still didn't speak, when Margaret dozed in the rocking chair and stirred at a whisper of movement, she found a small hand curled tightly around her fingers. And she knew. Whatever had happened out there, whatever scars had been added to the ones she already carried, the girl had chosen to come back. Not because she had nowhere else, but because Margaret was home. It was the envelope that changed everything, yellowed from the sun and dirt, edges frayed, but sealed tight with a careful press that made Margaret's heart pound the moment she saw it resting on the judge's desk. She hadn't been invited in. She wasn't supposed to see it. But as she stood in the doorway of the courthouse office, waiting on the creaking floorboards with the girl's small hand clutched in hers, she saw the name scrawled across the front in the child's uneven hand. "To Mama's Judge." Her breath caught like a thorn in her throat. The judge hadn't noticed her yet, hadn't looked up from the stack of paperwork he was scribbling through, glasses perched low and light pouring in through the dusty window behind him, casting long shadows across his desk. Margaret stepped forward, clearing her throat softly, but the judge raised a hand without lifting his head, motioning her to wait. She didn't sit, didn't speak. The girl pressed closer against her skirt, and then, finally, he looked up, his pale eyes squinting through the light, and fixed on the child like she was something unpleasant left on the porch. "Margaret Baines, isn't it?" he said, voice flat. "You were the one took the girl in without any legal documentation. No witness, no formal declaration." Margaret straightened her spine. "She was starving behind a saloon. I wasn't thinking about paperwork." The judge huffed. "That's the problem. No one thinks about the law until it's time to pay for breaking it." He picked up the letter absently, turning it in his fingers. "This yours?" Margaret hesitated. "It's hers." His eyebrows arched. "She doesn't speak. She writes," Margaret said quietly. "Sometimes." He broke the seal and opened the paper slow, unfolding it like it might fall apart in his hands. His lips moved as he read, though no sound came out. His expression didn't change, but his hands stilled. Then he set the letter down carefully and looked up at Margaret with something colder in his eyes than before. "Do you know what she wrote?" "No," Margaret whispered. "But I know whatever it was, she meant it. She said you read to her every night, that you call her sweetheart, that you let her sleep in your bed when it's cold. She said you made her mittens from your own dress, that you hum when you're brushing her hair so she doesn't get scared. And then," the judge paused, lifting the paper, "she said this, 'She's not my real mama, but if I could choose, I'd choose her.'" Margaret's throat closed. The judge set the letter aside and leaned back, folding his hands. "It's a sweet thing, sentimental, but not legal." The words hit like a slap. "What's legal?" Margaret said, trying to keep the tremble from her voice. "About leaving a child alone in the dirt. What's legal about letting her be thrown to the streets again because no one signed a paper? I didn't ask for her, but she came, and I gave her everything I had." The judge stood, tall and narrow, his black coat too big for his thin frame, and walked slowly around the desk. "You know what people say about you?" Margaret didn't answer. "They say you came to town expecting a wedding and ended up playing house with a ghost. That you got left and took in a child to fill the silence. That you're not stable. That you're not right." She took a step forward. "Do they say the same about the fathers who drink themselves to sleep every night? Or the mothers who slap their children in the market? Or the men who leave bruises and excuses behind every locked door?" Her voice cracked, sharp as glass. "Or is that just reserved for women like me?" For a long moment, the judge said nothing. Then he turned back to the desk, picked up a quill, and dipped it in ink. "There's going to be a hearing," he said. "You'll need a witness, someone who can testify to your care, a record of work, and she," he nodded at the girl, "needs to be present." Margaret nodded once, jaw clenched. "We'll be there." As she turned to go, the judge added, "I don't make decisions on sentiment, Mrs. Baines. I make them on law." Margaret paused in the doorway. "Then maybe the law needs to remember what it was made for." Outside, the sun was setting over the street, casting gold across the wooden walkways and catching on the dust like fireflies. The girl's hand stayed tight in hers, and though she still hadn't spoken since the night she returned, her eyes were wide, and knowing as she looked up, Margaret bent low, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. "We're not done," she whispered. Not even close. And though the road ahead would be lined with questions and glares, and the cold steel of law drawn like a line in the dirt, Margaret knew something the judge didn't. The girl had chosen. And so had she. The first knock went unanswered, swallowed by the hum of bees and the creak of the front porch settling in the heat. Margaret hesitated, dust clinging to her skirt. The girl's hand curled around hers tighter than before, and lifted her knuckles to the door again. This time it opened a crack, and one sharp blue eye peeked through. "If you're selling anything, you'd best keep walking." "I'm not," Margaret said quickly. "I need to speak with Mrs. Corbin." The eye narrowed. "What for?" "A testimony," Margaret said. "For a hearing. For the girl." That opened the door. The widow stepped back with surprising strength for a woman who looked like she'd been carved from smoke and grief. Her bun was tight, her blouse stiff, and her mouth a hard line as she scanned the girl. "She the one with no paw?" "She's the one with me," Margaret said. Mrs. Corbin didn't smile, didn't nod, just turned and walked inside without a word, leaving the door wide. Margaret followed, her boots quiet on the wood floor, eyes catching on the worn furniture, the lack of dust, the rows of ledgers stacked neatly beside a neat tea service no one had touched. The girl clung to her side, bare feet silent. "Sit," the widow said, and Margaret did, knees brushing against a table with lace doilies that looked too fine for touching. "I kept books for this town long before I buried my husband. There's nothing happens here I don't write down." She looked straight at Margaret. "So, why come to me?" "Because the judge won't listen to sentiment," Margaret said. "But he might listen to records. Hours worked, food bought, Boots mended, soap used, anything to show I didn't just feed her, I raised her. Mrs. Blank. Corbin's eyes flicked toward the girl again, who stared at the shelf of tea tins like they were magic boxes. And you think a ledger will make her yours? I think a ledger will prove I didn't leave her behind, Margaret said quietly. Not once. That seemed to land somewhere beneath the widow's ribs. She stood, walked to a shelf, and pulled down one of the ledger's green cloth binding, worn edges sand, opened it to a marked page. You bought fabric, a spool of thread, sugar, a doll with a button eye, twice the usual milk at the market. Her voice didn't change, but her hands moved slowly. There's a line here for penny candy, once a week, another for wool socks. There's even ink and paper. A child's hand in the margin, bad spelling, worse penmanship. Margaret felt heat behind her eyes. She practices while I sew. Sometimes she draws. The widow snapped the book shut. The judge won't like that I keep books like these. Says I'm nosy. But I say there's power in remembering. She walked back and laid the ledger on Margaret's lap. You'll take this with you to court. Margaret blinked. You give me your records? I'd give you the proof, she said. But more than that, I give you a warning. There's a man been asking questions, been seen talking to the judge, wears a city coat, slick hair, never smiles. Asked about the girl's birth name, the color drained from Margaret's face. What does he want? I don't know, the widow said. But he ain't looking for justice. He's looking for something to claim. The girl shifted, leaning into Margaret's side like she understood every word, even if no sound came from her mouth. Margaret wrapped an arm around her. Then we'll be ready. Thank you, Mrs. Corbin. The widow nodded once, then added, almost too softly, love doesn't always wear a ring. Sometimes it wears calluses and stays up through fevers. Sometimes it listens when nothing's said. But it's always seen, eventually. Margaret rose, ledger pressed to her chest like armor, and turned toward the door. We'll make sure the judge sees it. They stepped out into the sunlight, and for the first time, Margaret felt the road rising to meet her feet instead of pushing against them. But as they passed the alley near the general store, she saw the man the widow had spoken O'Flean, sharp, standing still as stone beneath the awning, with a notebook in hand and eyes that flicked over her, and the girl like he was already drawing the noose. Margaret pulled the girl closer, heart pounding, and kept walking, not slowing, not speaking. But she knew that man would be waiting at the hearing. And he'd come not for truth, but to unravel it. Inside her chest, a promise formed like steel. They would not lose each other, not to the law, not to silence, and not to men who thought love was something you needed permission for. The courthouse sat like a stern father at the edge of town, its roof low and square, its windows like watching eyes, and as Margaret climbed the steps with the girl's hand in hers, she could feel every glance from the townsfolk gathering outside, whispers folding over each other like wind-blown leaves, some curious, some cruel. The girl's dress was pressed, her hair tied back with a ribbon Margaret had stitched from the edge of her own wedding shawl, and though the child didn't speak, her grip on Margaret's fingers was firm, anchoring them both. Inside, the benches were half filled with the same faces that sold cornmeal, stitched saddles, and poured drinks. Now they played judge and jury with their stares. The sheriff stood near the front, hat in hand, eyes lowered like even he didn't believe what he'd been made to do. The judge entered last broad, shouldered, his boots heavy, his coat still dusty from travel. But it was the man beside him, the stranger in the city coat with ink-stained fingers and a ledger tucked beneath his arm, that made Margaret's spine lock in place. He didn't look at her, not fully, just nodded at the judge, as if passing a note without speaking. Margaret and the girl were asked to stand. State your name, the judge barked. Margaret Rose Whitlock, she said clearly, voice shaking only a little. And this girl with you? She has no birth name that I know, Margaret said slowly. She was living behind the saloon, sick, cold, and alone. The man in the city coat stepped forward then, voice like sandpaper. Objection. We have evidence the child's real name is Ellen Mays, daughter of Ruth Mays, deceased, born in Kansas Territory. The judge lifted a brow. That true? Margaret's heart thudded. I don't know what name she was born with. She's never spoken it. She never spoke at all until she called me Mama. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like someone had dropped a stone in still water. The girl clutched Margaret's skirt, eyes wide, and Margaret reached down, smoothing a hand over her hair. That's the only name that's mattered since. The man in the coat stepped forward again. Your Honor, I have here a document birth certificate, matching the child's age and description, signed by a distant uncle who is now requesting custody. His farm is in Kansas. He claims kinship. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The judge took the paper, scanned it, then looked down at the girl, whose small fingers trembled where they held Margaret's. Does the child understand any of this? He asked gruffly. Does she know what's happening? Margaret bent, knelt down beside the girl, heart hammering. Sweetheart, she whispered, brushing her hair back. They want to take you away, back east, to someone you've never met. You don't have to say anything. You just hold on. But the girl looked up then, slow and steady, and turned her face to the judge. Her lips parted, dry and unsure. Mama, she whispered, not loud, not brave. But the sound cracked like thunder through the wooden benches, and a hush followed it so thick even the flies seemed to stop midair. The judge blinked. The man in the coat stiffened, and Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat as she rose again, standing taller. She has never said anything before that. Not a word. Until now. The judge looked to the man in the city coat, whose jaw flexed, but no further argument came. Then the judge looked at the sheriff. You vouch for this? The sheriff, still holding his hat like it was a sin to wear it indoors, nodded once. That girl ain't had a soul 'cept Miss Whitlock since she came. Anyone in town could tell you. Murmurs of agreement stirred like wind in the pews. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing. This ain't usual. Not by a long mile. Blood counts for something, and so do papers. But sometimes a name given by the heart counts more. He paused. You'll bring me any further proof you have by next week. The ledger, the receipts, the witness statements. Until then, the girl stays where she's been. Margaret exhaled, her knees near buckling as she squeezed the girl's hand. The man in the coat didn't sit. He only turned and walked out, his coat swinging like a blade behind him. Outside, the townspeople parted to let them pass, silent now, not with judgment, but with something closer to reverence. The child didn't let go of Margaret's hand even once, not as they stepped down the courthouse steps, not as the sun burned hot against their shoulders, not even when a breeze stirred the dust around their boots and scattered the rest of the town's whispers into the silence she had finally broken. The porch creaked beneath Margaret's boots as she sat in the rocking chair just past sundown. The girl curled asleep in her lap with her tiny fingers still gripping the hem of Margaret's dress, like she feared the wind might take her if she let go. The stars had started to poke through the velvet sky above, and for the first time in weeks, the night didn't feel like a threat, but something closer to a lullaby. Yet Margaret's hands weren't still. In them she held a folded letter, its edges worn and smudged, a letter she hadn't dared to send, not because she lacked courage, but because there was nowhere it belonged. It wasn't addressed to the judge, or the city man with his documents and cold, distant eyes. It wasn't even meant for the girl asleep in her arms. It was meant for someone who had left long ago, someone who had promised a life out west and vanished like morning fog. To Mr. Ezra Kane, it began, written in a trembling hand months ago. You never came, but I did. She had written it in a heat of anger and a flood of tears after 3 nights at the station boarding house, waiting. The sheriff had told her Ezra's claim had been bought out. No forwarding address, no explanation, just a woman alone in a town with no place to go and a trunk full of stitched linens and foolish hopes. I stayed because I thought maybe it was a mistake, the letter went on, because I believed a woman could still build something of her own even when the world said she needed a man's name to claim a roof or a future. She stared at the words now, ink faded but truth still raw. She hadn't mailed it then because she hadn't needed to. Not after finding the girl curled in the alley behind the saloon with blood on her lip and eyes too big for her face. A girl who didn't ask for help, didn't beg, didn't cry, just looked up at Margaret like she'd already tried everything else in the world and was ready to disappear if this didn't work. Margaret folded the letter again slowly, careful not to wake the child in her lap. The girl's breathing was soft now, rhythmic. There had been no more questions from the court this week. No sign of the city man, though word had it he'd ridden back east and planned to return with a cousin who claimed to know the girl's mother's name. But Margaret didn't flinch anymore when she heard rumors. What mattered wasn't paper. What mattered was how the child looked for her first thing in the morning, how she ran to her when thunder cracked, how she started to hum when Margaret sang while washing dishes. Her voice was still barely more than a whisper, but it was there. "Mama," she'd said once more at the market, just 2 days after the courtroom, pointing to a scarf Margaret had dropped. Not loud, not performative, just truth, shaped in a child's lips. Inside the house, the fire had burned low and the supper dishes sat waiting in a tin pail, but Margaret didn't move. She stared out across the fields instead, into the stillness that wrapped around them, and thought about name shows. Some people earned them, how others lost them, and how sometimes the most sacred names were the ones chosen in moments no one else saw. The girl still had no past she spoke of, no memories offered. Margaret didn't push. Healing didn't come on demand. It came in slow pieces, half steps, shadows softening, silence thawing like frost. A wagon creaked in the distance. A dog barked once, then fell quiet again. Life in the West didn't pause for heartache, but it had a way of noticing it, making space around it like brush parting for a rider too tired to push. Margaret looked down at the girl's face, peaceful now, and let herself believe something she'd held back before, that this wasn't a mistake. That she hadn't stumbled into motherhood like someone tripping into a hole, but had answered something older than blood, something rooted. The letter remained in her hands, creased and faded. And then slowly she brought it to the oil lamp beside her, held it to the flame. It caught fast. A flicker, then a curl of black rising into the night air like a secret released. She didn't need Ezra's reply. She didn't need his apology. Whatever future she had once imagined with him had burned away long before this flame. She had a new name now, too, even if the town didn't write it on any church roll or legal form. She was Mama, and the girl her girl had chosen that. The ashes drifted down into the dirt beside the porch, vanishing with the last light. And in her arms, the girl stirred, blinked once, then nestled closer, safe in the arms of the only home she'd ever trusted. The knock came just before breakfast, sharp and final, the kind that didn't ask for permission but declared something had already been decided. Margaret looked up from the hearth where she'd been ladling oats into tin bowls, her hand frozen in the steam, the girl perched on the edge of a stool with a spoon too big for her hand. They both went still. Another knock, louder. Margaret rose slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and opened the door. It was the sheriff. Behind him stood a man in a brown suit, neatly pressed, too neat for this town. And behind that man, a horse hitched to a wagon already turned toward the road, as if ready to carry something away. "Miss Margaret," the sheriff said, tipping his hat, but there was no warmth in his voice. Here's Mr. Eldridge. He's from the state office in Topeka." The man in the suit stepped forward, his eyes not cruel but tired, like someone who lived buried in paperwork and the law's heavy silence. "I've come to escort the girl," he said plainly, without ceremony. "We've located surviving kin. Her aunt in Chicago filed a claim for custody last month. I have papers here." Margaret didn't hear the rest. It was as if someone had struck her in the chest with a wooden plank. The girl had risen from the stool, her eyes wide, the spoon clattering to the floor. "No," Margaret said, her voice low but steady, a storm gathering. "She's not going anywhere." Mr. Eldridge didn't flinch. He simply unrolled the documents in his hand, crisp and freshly inked. The sheriff took his hat off and stepped back, as if distancing himself from what was about to unfold. "I understand this is upsetting, ma'am," Eldridge said, "but legal guardianship defaults to bloodkin unless otherwise established. You have no adoption papers, no formal claim. She's not yours." "She is," Margaret said, her voice sharper now, rising like a blade drawn. "She chose me. She called me Mama. You don't need a paper for that." The girl had crept to Margaret's side, silent but trembling, her hand seeking Margaret's skirt and grabbing hold. Eldridge glanced at her, then back at Margaret. I sympathize, truly. But the law doesn't bend for sentiment. The train departs at noon. I suggest you help her pack. Margaret stood her ground. We'll see about that. She turned on her heel, dragging the girl gently but firmly inside. The door shut behind them with a thud. She dressed the child in her best calico dress and wrapped her in the shawl she'd knit by hand over winter, then scooped her into her arms and climbed into the wagon, dust swirling around them as they rode into town. Her boots struck the courthouse steps like hammers as she marched inside, straight to the judge's office. The same judge from the last hearing, the one who had paused when the girl first said "Mama." His brows raised when he saw them. Back so soon, Miss Margaret? She didn't wait. They're trying to take her. Some man from Topeka claims she's got an aunt who wants her. But that woman wasn't here when this child was starving behind a saloon. She didn't hold her through fever or brush the tangles out of her hair when she couldn't sleep. I did. The judge leaned back in his chair, folding his hands slowly. Do you have any proof she's better off with you? Proof? Margaret repeated, shaking. I have the word of a child who'd rather die than speak. And she spoke for me. Isn't that enough? The girl had climbed onto the chair beside her, knees tucked beneath her, wide eyes watching the judge like he held thunder in his mouth. The room went still. Mama, she whispered again, soft as dawn. And something cracked in the judge's face. Not a smile, not pity, just the recognition of a truth that carried weight. He nodded once, then reached for a blank page. Tell me her full name, Miss Margaret, he said quietly, and how long she's lived under your roof. Margaret blinked, stunned. Her name's Clara. She's been with me near 9 months now. The pen scratched across the page. Then we'll start the paperwork today. It'll take time to process. But you'll have something by the end of the week. Relief crashed into Margaret like a wave, and her knees buckled slightly under the release of it. She gathered Clara into her arms, the girl clinging to her now like roots to soil. Outside, the man from Topeka paced beside his wagon, papers fluttering in the wind like they'd never mattered in the first place. Margaret stepped out onto the street, lifted her chin, and met his stare. She's staying, she said. We'll send you the official notice. Mr. Eldridge studied her for a moment, then sighed and tipped his hat, not in victory, but in quiet resignation. He turned, climbed into his wagon, and rode off without another word. The town watched from windows and porches, their silence not cruel this time, but awed, as if they'd seen something holy pass through. And Margaret walked home with Clara's hand in hers, knowing that sometimes family wasn't written in ink, but in the way a child looked at you when the whole world tried to pull her away, and she still chose to stay. The first snowfall came early that year, dusting the rooftops and covering the rutted road with a clean white silence. Margaret stood on the porch wrapped in her wool shawl, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, watching as Clara ran barefoot through the flakes, her arms out like wings, her laughter slicing through the cold air like a song Margaret had waited her whole life to hear. The legal documents had arrived 2 weeks ago, crisp and heavy, bearing both their names. Margaret had run her fingers over the ink like it was a brand seared into her skin, proof that love had roots deeper than blood. But she hadn't told Clara yet. Not because she was hiding it, but because she knew that paper was just a symbol, a formality. What mattered was already growing between them, unshakable and real. And still, as Clara danced in the snow, Margaret called her over. Come sit, chickadee, she said, and the girl scrambled up the porch steps, breathless and red-cheeked, snow melting in her curls. Margaret pulled the shawl around both of them, letting Clara tuck herself close into her side. She pulled the papers from the inside of her coat and unfolded them slowly. This came from the judge, she said, her voice steady. It says you're mine now. For good. Clara looked at the document with the reverence of a sacred text, her small fingers tracing the letters of her name, which Margaret had spelled with care. Clara Ann Whitfield. The last name Margaret's own. Clara's brow furrowed. That's not my name, she said, voice small. Not the one before. Margaret blinked, surprised, not because Clara remembered, but because this was the first time she had asked about what came before. "Do you remember your real name?" Clara shrugged. "Bits of it. My mama used to hum it. Sounded like stars. But I like this one too. It feels warm." Margaret's throat caught. "You can have both," she said. "You can carry all of it. The name your birth mama gave you, and the one we build together. There's no rule that says you have to choose." Clara thought about that, serious and quiet in the way only children can be. "Can I be both?" "You already are," Margaret said. "You always have been." They sat like that for a while, the snow settling around them, not quite melting, not quite sticking. Like the town itself couldn't decide whether to stay frozen in its old ways or let something new take root. Later that week, Pastor Whitmore came by with a basket of bread and awkward condolences, fumbling through his words about how he hadn't known how to stand by Margaret during the court ordeal. Margaret accepted the bread, nodded politely, but she didn't need apologies. What she needed, she already had. Clara was painting again, smearing colors across butcher paper, with fingers sticky from jam and truth. The girl barely spoke still, but she sang sometimes now, strange, wordless tunes that made Margaret's heart twist with a kind of holy ache. One afternoon, Clara brought her a drawing. "This is us," she said. "This is the tree we planted, and that one's Mama." She pointed at a crooked figure in the corner, a woman drawn with golden hair and arms reaching wide enough to wrap around the world. Margaret knelt and held the paper like it was a map home. "That's beautiful, baby," she whispered. "But where's you?" Clara frowned. "I'm the roots," she said. Underneath, Margaret felt something crack inside, not in pain but in recognition. The girl wasn't trying to be seen anymore. She was trying to grow. One morning, Sheriff Daniels stopped by to deliver news that the aunt in Chicago had withdrawn her claim. Said she never knew the child, just heard from some family that she'd been abandoned out west. Once she read the transcript from the hearing, she said she didn't want to disrupt what was clearly God's will. Margaret didn't respond right away. She only nodded, then closed the door gently behind him, her hands shaking with the quiet magnitude of a fight finally won. That night, Margaret pulled out the family Bible, the one her mother had carried across the Mississippi in a wagon that had lost a wheel and almost cost her life. She opened it to the page with the family tree and, for the first time, wrote a name beneath her own, Clara Ann Whitfield. No hesitation, no apology. Clara watched from the edge of the table, eyes wide. "That makes it real?" she asked. "No, sweetheart," Margaret said, lifting her into her lap. "We made it real a long time ago. This just makes it official." The girl leaned her head against Margaret's chest, listening to her heartbeat, like it was a song she'd heard before, long ago, before the cold nights behind the saloon and the courtroom and the voices that called her astray. "Mama," she whispered, and Margaret closed her eyes, holding on as the snow fell softly outside, settling over the land like a promise kept. The bell above the church door had just begun to toll when Margaret saw him leaning against the post like he'd been waiting for years, not hours, his hat pulled low and the lines on his face carved by more than weather. Clara stood beside Margaret, her tiny hand clutching the lace edge of her Sunday dress, her dark eyes fixed on the stranger, as if she recognized something in his silhouette. The whole town was inside the chapel that morning, giving thanks for the thaw, for the end of the bitter winter. And Margaret had thought maybe, just maybe, they'd finally come around. She hadn't expected a ghost to rise from the gravel. "Are you Margaret Whitfield?" the man asked, his voice ragged like it had to drag itself out from the bottom of his chest. Margaret stood straighter, pulling Clara gently behind her. "Who's asking?" He tipped his hat back then, revealing eyes the same color as Clara's. Not the same shape, not the same age, but the same ache. "Name's Elias Crane," he said. "I think you might have taken in my daughter." The wind stopped. The bell's echo died. And Margaret felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, like someone had pulled the world out from under her ribs. Clara said nothing. She only stared, and slowly, without being told, she stepped from behind Margaret's skirt and walked up to the man. She tilted her head, studying his face with that quiet, unflinching way of hers, and then said, "You're not him." Elias blinked. "Not who?" The man from before, she whispered. The bad one. And just like that, Margaret's breath returned, sharp and cold. She stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Clara's shoulder. What do you want? Elias looked down, then back up, pain etched across his brow like a brand. I ain't here to take her. I thought she might be mine. My sister's girl, maybe. Or someone left behind from a time I should have done more. I got a letter from Chicago from her aunt. She said the girl was in a courtroom, called a stranger Mama. Said maybe I ought to go see for myself. You should have stayed gone, Margaret said, her voice firm but not cruel. Elias nodded, as if he'd expected that. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn photograph, yellowing at the edges, showing a baby girl with a crooked tooth and curls tied in string. That's my Lily. She died 3 years ago, died angry at me for all the things I didn't fix. That girl there, she looks just like her. Clara stepped forward again, her eyes never leaving his. Your Lily's gone, she said, but I'm here. He knelt then, slow and reverent, placing the photo gently in her hand. You are, and I'm sorry if that hurts. I ain't asking for anything. Just wanted to see. Clara stared at the photo. Then, softly, she handed it back. You can keep her. Elias took it like it weighed more than his guilt. Margaret's heart twisted at the mercy in Clara's voice, at the way the child gave kindness so easily, the kind of kindness that had to be taught by someone who knew what it meant to go without it. Will you stay for the service? Margaret asked, surprising even herself. Elias looked unsure. Would it be all right? Clara nodded. Only if you sit in the back. And so he did. All through the hymns and the preacher's talk of redemption and second chances, Elias sat there, hat in his lap, hands folded like a man begging forgiveness without words. And when it ended, he didn't rush out. He waited until every family had passed, until even Pastor Whitmore gave a quiet nod of acknowledgement before he approached again. She's yours, Elias said, eyes brimming. Even if she came from someone else's blood, I see it. You're the only one who ever looked at her like she was whole. Margaret said nothing, only nodded. That night, after supper, Clara curled up beside Margaret with her head resting on her lap, her thumb brushing back and forth across the hem of Margaret's dress. He wasn't bad, she said. Just broken. Margaret stroked her hair, a lump in her throat too thick to swallow. That's true, baby. And broken people can still do good things if they try. Clara looked up at her then. Will he come back? Maybe, Margaret said, but not to take you. He saw who you belong to now. Clara nodded once, satisfied, and drifted off to sleep with her arms wrapped tight around Margaret's waist like she was holding on to the only thing in the world that couldn't disappear. Margaret sat there in the firelight, staring into the shadows, and whispered to no one, and I'll never let her go. The courtroom smelled of dust and tobacco, and the wooden benches creaked under the weight of townsfolk who had come not for justice, but for gossip. Margaret stood alone at the front, her palms pressed flat against her skirt to keep them from trembling, her heart thudding with the weight of every heartbeat that had led her to this moment. Clara sat just behind her, swinging her feet in shoes that didn't quite fit, clutching a small doll that had been sewn from scraps and love. The judge was a man of stiff collars and glassy eyes, the kind who measured a person not by truth but by order, by signatures and bloodlines and rules too brittle to hold something as wild and alive as love. State your claim, he barked, not looking up from his paperwork. Margaret's voice came low but steady. The girl belongs with me. She's been in my care for nearly a year. I provide her food, shelter, school. She calls me Mama. The judge glanced at Clara, his eyes narrowing. And what name does she carry? What blood runs in her veins? Did you adopt her by law? The courtroom fell silent. Margaret swallowed. She had no name when I found her, no family. I gave her mine. And no, I didn't go through the courts. I didn't have the means. But she's mine in every way that matters. Murmurs rippled through the benches. Sheriff Harlan leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. He'd brought Clara in last month on suspicion of stealing bread, even though the shopkeep later admitted it was a misunderstanding. But the law didn't forget a face once it was in its book, The judge adjusted his spectacles. That may be so in your heart, Miss Whitfield, but the law requires more than sentiment. A child's custody is not assigned through affection. Then the law is blind, Margaret shot back, and the room drew in its breath. Because affection is the only reason that child is alive today. The judge stiffened. Careful now. But Margaret stepped forward. She was starving in an alley, half her ribs showing. Couldn't speak a word. Nobody came for her. Not the town, not a family, not the law. I didn't wait for permission. I fed her. I held her when she had night terrors. I taught her to read, to speak, to laugh again. And now you want to rip her away because I didn't have a stamp on paper? Clara slid from her seat and walked to the front, standing beside Margaret. The judge eyed her with that same cold detachment. And what do you have to say, child? Clara looked up at him, then at Margaret. She clutched her doll tighter. I didn't have a name, she said softly. I didn't have a voice. Mama gave me both. The judge blinked. She is not your mother by law. But she's my mother by love, Clara said louder this time. She's the only person who sees me. Something shifted in the room. Even the sheriff's boots seemed to ease their stance. A widow from the church wiped a tear from her cheek. The judge cleared his throat, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for a document. This court acknowledges the bond presented, but without formal adoption or proven guardianship, I cannot assign legal custody today. Margaret's jaw clenched. Then what are you saying? I am saying the girl will remain in your care, he replied slowly, but under supervision from the county, until such time as papers are filed. I will give you 60 days to make it official. Margaret exhaled so hard it felt like her ribs cracked. Clara turned to her, her eyes wide. Does that mean I stay? Margaret knelt, cupping the girl's face. You stay, baby. You stay with me. We just have to sign some papers. Clara threw her arms around Margaret's neck, and Margaret closed her eyes, holding her like she was made of breath and promise. Behind them, the judge tapped his gavel once, and the crowd began to rise, but the sound barely registered. Sheriff Harlan approached quietly. You did good, he muttered. But don't wait too long. This town forgets its mercy fast. Margaret nodded. I won't give them the chance. Outside the courthouse, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting gold light across the dusty street. Clara held Margaret's hand tighter than ever, and they walked forward not as two strangers bound by chance, but as family unwritten, unblooded, and undeniably real. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the quilt that had once belonged to a woman she never met but imagined often some ranch wife with flour-dusted hands and a tired heart who had sewn hope into each thread. Clara was asleep beside her, small hand curled around Margaret's wrist like a vine refusing to let go, and the rise and fall of her chest was steadier than it had ever been in the early days. The days when she wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat unless Margaret turned her back, when her little body flinched at the sound of boots on wood, and her eyes held stories she didn't yet know how to tell. The trial had ended, but the echo of it clung to Margaret's ribs like frost. They'd won if you could call being granted permission to keep your own child a victory, but nothing about the victory felt clean. The judge's words had not left her. Supervision, signatures, 60 days. The town's sympathy was fickle. She knew that well. And what they'd clapped for in the courtroom might sour the moment Clara picked up a rock in the wrong part of the street. But for tonight, she let all that fall away. For tonight, she let herself feel the weight of a child asleep beside her, trusting, whole. She reached out and brushed back a strand of hair from Clara's face, marveling again at how the girl had grown. Her cheeks were fuller now, no longer sunken. Her hands didn't shake. She laughed, sometimes sudden, bright peals of it that startled Margaret still. There was healing there, real healing, and it had nothing to do with forms or laws or town approval. It had everything to do with love worn raw, love tested in the cold and the dirt and the silence. The next morning, the sun was still low and slanting gold through the windows when Clara tugged on Margaret's sleeve. "Can I go with you?" she asked, voice hoarse from sleep. Margaret blinked. "To where?" "To the store." "I want to hold the list." Something about the way she said it, like she was asking to carry something important, like she wanted to be part of the world again, made Margaret nod before the sentence was even done. She wrapped Clara in her coat, the sleeves still too long, and they walked together past the old saloon where Margaret had once found her, curled behind the barrels like a leaf trying to survive winter. The shopkeeper eyed them as they entered, then offered Clara a smile that was half apology, half curiosity. Clara didn't flinch. She took the list from Margaret's hand and began reading in a whisper flower. Beans. Lye soap like it was scripture. Margaret stepped back and let her speak, let her point, watched the way she stood taller with each item crossed off. Outside, they passed a group of boys playing in the dust. One called out, "Hey, that your daughter now?" Margaret turned, expecting Clara to shrink, to duck behind her skirt, but Clara stood firm. "Yes," she said, loud enough to make them pause. "She's my mother." The boys blinked. One shrugged and kicked a rock. Another nodded. Just like that, the world didn't end. Margaret felt her chest stretch with something fierce and unfamiliar. Not pride, exactly more like awe. Awe at how a child could be broken and rebuild herself in the same place where the breaking happened. That afternoon, Clara brought out her doll and began stitching a new dress for it. Margaret offered to help, but Clara shook her head. "I want to make it myself. I want her to have something that's just hers." Margaret said nothing. She just watched as the girl's fingers moved with care, with intention, with love. The same way Margaret's had once moved over her own mother's sewing, back when she'd still believed in quiet mornings and promises kept. As the sun dipped behind the hills, turning the sky into a bruised canvas of purples and fire, Clara climbed into Margaret's lap without a word and curled against her chest. "Mama," she said, soft and clear. "Yes, sweetheart. I remember something." Margaret stilled. "What do you remember?" "A song. From before. I think my real mother sang it." Margaret's heart twisted, but she nodded. "Can you sing it?" Clara shook her head. "Not yet. Just pieces. But I think I can sing it to my doll first. She needs to be brave too." Margaret kissed the crown of her head. "That's a good idea. When you're ready, you can sing it to me too." They sat like that, firelight flickering across the walls, shadows dancing on the floorboards, and something unspoken filling the space between them, something stronger than law, or name, or blood. It was the quiet miracle of belonging. It was the first day Clara had called her mother, without fear, without needing to explain it, and the first day Margaret believed she truly was. Not because a judge said so, not because the town had seen it, but because love had spoken it aloud in the language only hearts understand. The wind carried dust in thin ribbons across the steps of the courthouse, as Margaret stood there clutching Clara's hand, the sun behind them casting long shadows across the wooden planks. Her heart beat with the steady rhythm of something sacred and unyielding, the kind of quiet defiance that came not from anger, but from love grown wild and unshakable. Clara's other hand gripped the doll she'd sewn the dress for, the frayed cotton edge peeking out from her coat pocket like a secret held close. The clerk pushed the door open and gestured them inside, his spectacles sliding halfway down his nose, and Margaret felt the weight of every moment that had led to this, every unspoken promise, every soft bedtime word, every stitch in every dress and every bowl of porridge set gently on the table. The adoption papers lay flat on the desk, creamy and too clean, waiting for ink to turn them into truth. The judge wasn't there this time, just the clerk and his ink-stained fingers, and a quiet room where dust motes drifted like tiny angels watching something holy unfold. "You'll sign here," the man said, tapping the bottom of the page. Margaret reached for the pen but paused when Clara's voice broke the silence. "Can I sign too?" Her voice was soft, careful, as if testing the space for danger, and Margaret looked at her, saw not the orphan girl she'd once found behind the saloon, but a child who had stitched a dress for a doll and stood tall before courtroom stairs and called her mama without trembling. "You don't need to," Margaret whispered, brushing a curl from Clara's brow. "But I want to," Clara said. The clerk frowned but didn't argue. He slid the paper over and pointed. Clara signed it with small, crooked letters, CLARA and. When it was done, she smiled at it like she'd carved her name into a stone that wouldn't wash away. Margaret added her signature next, her hand steady, then pressed her palm against the paper, willing every ounce of warmth she had into it. "That's it," the clerk said. "It's official." But it had been official in Margaret's soul since the day Clara first handed her a spoon instead of scurrying off with it, since the day she'd wept without hiding it, since the first time she'd said mama with no courtroom, no crowd, just two hearts trying to speak the same language. They left the courthouse without fanfare. The weight of the moment held quiet between them. Outside, Clara stopped suddenly and turned to Margaret. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Margaret blinked. "Who?" "My first mother." The question caught in Margaret's throat. She knelt, placing both hands on Clara's shoulders. "I think she'd be proud of how brave you are, and how kind, and how strong your heart is. I think if she could see you now, she'd thank you for letting me love you." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. She just nodded and wrapped her arms around Margaret's neck and held on like the earth might shake. That evening, they made biscuits and honey from scratch. Clara insisted on measuring the flour herself, dusting it across her cheeks like war paint as she laughed and danced around the kitchen. Margaret let herself laugh too, let the sound echo off the walls that had once held only silence. When the biscuits were done, they sat at the small table, hands sticky with sweetness, and Margaret reached for the candle on the shelf. She lit it with a match and placed it between them. "What's that for?" Clara asked, licking honey from her thumb. "For her," Margaret said. "So she knows she's remembered. So she knows she's part of this home too." Clara stared at the flame, her eyes reflecting its flicker, and then she nodded. "Can we light one every year?" "Every year," Margaret said. "Every time we need to remember how far we've come." That night, Clara pulled her quilt all the way up to her chin but left her doll by the foot of the bed, no longer needing to clutch it through the dark. Margaret watched from the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, her breath caught between prayer and gratitude. "Mama?" Clara called. "Yes, sweetheart?" "I like our last name," Margaret smiled. "I like it too." And just like that, the name written on the paper became more than ink. It became a thread sewn into both their hearts, a name chosen not by birth but by courage, by tenderness, by fire-tested love that refused to give up. The morning sun rose slow over the town, painting the edges of the rooftops in gold and warming the dust that never seemed to settle. But Margaret was already awake, standing by the stove with her sleeves rolled up and her thoughts drifting somewhere between hope and memory. The cabin smelled of biscuits again, though not the hurried kind made on cold mornings when there wasn't time to sit. These were Sunday biscuits tender, butter-rich, and made for lingering. Clara sat at the table, swinging her legs under the chair, humming a tune she'd learned from the piano man at the saloon who used to play with a flask tucked in his boot. The court hearing had passed, the paper was signed, and the town had gone quiet again, no longer whispering about the woman with the orphan girl who dared to stand in front of a judge and call it family. But Margaret knew silence didn't mean forgetting. People watched from behind windows, wondering if this would stick, if the girl would run, or the woman would buckle under the weight of something she'd chosen but hadn't been born into. But love didn't need blood, and family didn't need permission, it only needed staying. The knock came soft at first, like someone testing whether they truly had the right to be heard. Margaret wiped her hands and opened the door to find old Mr. Haynes from the general store, holding a worn paper bag and looking sheepish. "Brought some sugar," he said. "Figured maybe you ran out, what with all the baking." His voice stumbled over itself, unsure if this counted as kindness or intrusion. Margaret took the bag and smiled, a small but open gesture. "Thank you. That's kind, and," he added, clearing his throat, "heard the girl did well in court. Brave thing that, calling you mama like that in front of everyone. You raised her strong." Margaret didn't correct him, didn't say she hadn't raised Clara from birth or even from babyhood. What mattered now was the growing part, not the start. "She's got more heart than most men in this town," Margaret said. Mr. Haynes nodded, tipped his hat, and shuffled off without another word, but something in the air had shifted. That evening, Margaret found an old wooden chair in the barn, the kind with one leg shorter than the rest and a crack in the seat. where someone once dropped a heavy sack of oats. She dragged it inside, sanded the splinters smooth, and painted it the softest blue she could find in her leftover paints. Clara watched from the stairs, tilting her head. "Who's that for?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She just ran her fingers along the back of the chair, then set it beside the table, tucking it in gently. "For whoever needs it," she said. "Someday, someone else might." Clara walked over and placed her doll on the seat, smiling like she already knew the answer. Over the next few days, small things began to change. The preacher, who hadn't looked them in the eye since the first hearing, nodded at them in the street. Mrs. Lorna from the bakery handed Clara a warm roll without asking for coins. And the sheriff, who once doubted Margaret's right to anything other than pity, tipped his hat as he passed, the edge of guilt hanging on his glance. But Margaret didn't care for the town's apology, not in words or gestures. She only cared that Clara smiled more now, that her laughter rang out in the garden when she chased butterflies barefoot, that her nightmares came less often, and when they did, she climbed into Margaret's bed without hesitation, without shame, and curled against her like roots finding soil after a long, barren season. One afternoon, as they hung laundry in the sun, Clara turned to her with a question that pulled the breath from her lungs. "Can I call you Mama even when we're not at home?" Margaret dropped the sheet she was holding and knelt down, her hands still damp. "You can call me Mama wherever your heart tells you to. There's no place in this world where that word doesn't belong to us." Clara nodded, then whispered it like a promise. "Mama." And Margaret closed her eyes against the wind that suddenly felt warm and alive. That night, they lit another candle, this one for the future. They didn't speak as the flame danced. Didn't need to. In that quiet, Margaret saw the chair, the paper, the courtroom, the child behind the saloon, the biscuits and honey, and every inch of love they'd fought for. And she knew something deep and holy. Love wasn't what you claimed in public or proved with ink. It was what you stayed for. It was what you showed up for, again and again, even when the town turned its back, even when you had no blueprint, even when the child you loved was silent, wounded, and hiding. That night, the blue chair sat empty by the table, bathed in firelight, waiting for the next soul to know it had a place. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If this story touched you, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us feel a little closer across the miles. Every story finds its home in the hearts of those who need it, and sometimes that's all it takes. If you'd like to hear more stories that lift the spirit and remind us of the quiet miracles around us, feel free to subscribe. We're building something meaningful here, and it means so much to have you along the way. From our hearts to yours, thank you for spending this time with us.